My name is Davita Ingram, and I am Public Engagement Programs Manager at the Central Library. Tonight's program is made possible with support from the Seattle Public Library Foundation and the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, also known as NERP. You can give them a round of applause. I'm delighted to bring our event partner, the Seattle Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, to the stage to do our opening welcome. And I'll be back to introduce our speaker, Jorge Barron, and to share a few items about hospitality. So please give a warm round of applause for Joaquin Wee.
Hello, my name is Joaquin Wee with the Seattle Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, one of the sponsors of tonight's event. Thank you all for being here tonight. The mission of our office is quite simple. It's to improve the lives of Seattle's immigrant and refugee communities. And as you can imagine, our mission has been more important than ever and more challenging than ever. Some of you may have heard that at the request of Mayor Ed Murray, we organized the event titled Seattle United for Immigrant and Refugee Families, offering free legal assistance to immigrants of any status on January 20th, Inauguration Day. We wanted to send a message that the city of Seattle stands as a welcoming city and that the authoritarian anti-immigrant values coming from the other Washington are contrary to our values here in the city of Seattle. And we're just getting started. We're honored to be partnering with the Seattle Public Library on this event. The Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs is committed to ensuring that all departments in the city integrate welcoming city policies, initiatives, and actions. I also wanted to let you know that we'll be passing around a clipboard with a pen. If you want to join the email list just for the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, you can sign up on that piece of paper. We promise not to spam you, but that's a good way to learn about upcoming immigrant and refugee events. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. Okay, back to Davita. Thank you.
All right. I'm cutting some of my remarks short so we can get to Jorge's presentation, but these are some important things. If you can, please silence your cell phones. But if you'd like to use them to tweet, you can tag us at SPL Buzz to share what you learned tonight. If you happen to need a restroom, you can exit through the back of the auditorium or to this side of the auditorium to get to the restroom. Please use the restroom that best suits your gender identity, and if you need any help, we're always here to help you. We'll have surveys at the end of the night, and I'd love to bring up Jorge Barron. I'm going to just share a little bit about him. He's the executive director at the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. He's passionate about advocating on behalf of immigrants and is firmly rooted in his own immigrant experience. He is originally from Bogota, Colombia, and came to the United States at the age of 13. Jorge is a graduate of Yale Law School and Duke University, so please give a warm round of applause for Jorge.
Let me see. I think I can do this one. Is this one working? Yes, there we go. It took a moment to kick in. Thank you very much, and I want to say thank you to start off. Thank the Seattle Public Library and the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs for their partnership with us and helping us put together this event. This is like the best thing when other people do all the work to set up the event. And I want to start off just by saying thank you to all of you for being here. I'm going to actually skip over some of these slides here that we didn't use. I think it's really important that you're here because I think one of the things that we find with regard to immigration policy is that people are oftentimes, it's a controversial subject, and so people oftentimes don't engage because they're worried about it. They're afraid they might say the wrong thing, And it's complicated. I mean, I think a lot of folks who are talking about this theme sometimes make it as a very simple matter, and I want to acknowledge in the beginning, and you'll see, and part of what we're hoping you will see is how complicated it can be for people navigating the system. And so I want to say thank you for being here and for spending the time to understand the issues and to figure out how we can best serve immigrant and refugee communities. I also wanted to just acknowledge that we're trying to pack a lot of information in it's a good chunk of time, but there's a lot of information to pack, so you're going to be hearing me talk for a while, and I want to acknowledge that, and I appreciate your patience. We're going to have a Q&A that I hope will be a good way for us to converse and for me to address questions that people might have, but I want to acknowledge that I'm going to be talking at you for a while, which is not always the best way to do things, but given the amount of information, this is the way we're going to run the program. So let's get started. I also want to tell you, we do have copies of the PowerPoint up front, except that it's a slightly older version of the PowerPoint that I screwed up in sending to folks. So if you do have a copy and you're trying to follow along, I'll just flag that there are just slight variations from the PowerPoint that we'll show. But what we're going to do is that we're going to post this on our website under the Resources tab, and I'll show you where that is at the end of the presentation. So if you're following through and you want to get a copy of the PowerPoint deck, you can pull it down. And I know, obviously, we're also live streaming and recording this, so that will be up by tomorrow on our website, which I'll share at the end. So just a quick note for those of you that don't know about Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, I want to just give a quick overview of what we do. We're a nonprofit organization that's been providing services here in the state for 33 years. We started serving Central American refugees back in that time in the mid-1980s. We now have grown to serve people from 130 countries, and our primary role is to provide assistance on individual cases as people navigate the immigration system, but we also do community education and systemic advocacy where we're trying to change immigration policies and practices around the state. We have 4 offices, 2 in Eastern Washington in Wenatchee and Granger, an office in Tacoma that's mostly focused on serving people at the Immigration Detention Center, which I'll explain, and then our office here in Seattle. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today. And again, we have a packed agenda. So, and I know there may be some folks in the audience who've already attended some of these presentations, and so I hope you'll bear with me, or some folks who already have a familiarity with the immigration system. So the first section, we're going to do kind of a quick overview of what our immigration system looks like, just very basic, and I hope you understand that there's a lot of complexity in a lot of these areas. So we're going to try to just make it very quick. And then we're going to talk about the deportation process, deportation and detention, and how that works. And then we're going to get into, I'm going to talk briefly about some special protections that don't cover a lot of people in the community, but that are also sometimes not as well known, and I want to make sure that people are aware about them, particularly folks who are working with immigrants and refugee communities, to make sure that if they find out people who might benefit from these protections, that they're aware of them. And then I'm leaving towards the end, the second half, the developments that have been happening more recently and the changes that are happening, that are already starting to happen and that might happen under the new administration. And because I fear that I think that's probably a lot of what you want to hear about. And so if I did it at the beginning, you would all walk out, and I don't want to do that. So, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how we can empower communities and provide information to community members about what's happening and information. And then we'll tackle some frequently asked questions that I'm hoping to address before we turn it over to all of you for questions and hopefully some good answers. So let's get started. We're going to start with this basic overview of our immigration system. And again, this is a very high-level system. And before we get started into that dynamic, I want to talk about some acronyms and names and agencies, because I'm going to be talking about them throughout the presentation. So let me just tell you about the immigration agencies that are involved in our system. So most of our immigration agencies are now focused in the Department of Homeland Security, and we're talking about at the federal level. So the Department of Homeland Security has a lot of components to it. It includes things like TSA and Secret Service and all that stuff. But it also has 3 agencies in particular that are very involved with immigration. The first one is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS. They're basically the agency that grants benefits. So when you go to apply for citizenship or to apply for a green card, and I'll explain what a green card is in a minute, that's the agency that you go to. There's also Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, which is probably the agency that gets the most attention in the news. That is what I effectively call the law enforcement arm of immigration. They're the ones, people who are in charge of going to deport people and to put people in deportation proceedings, and we'll talk about them throughout the presentation. There's also Customs and Border Protection that has a role. Customs and Border Protection is the agency that when you travel internationally, you get to the airport, they stamp your passport. Those folks are from CBP. But they're also here in Washington State. We have a pretty big presence of Border Patrol agents, which is also part of the Customs and Border Protection Agency. And we actually have a lot of Border Patrol agents in our state, particularly in the northern counties and in the Olympic Peninsula. So we'll talk about how they may interact with people as well. So those are part of the Department of Homeland Security. I always flag to people here in our state that sometimes community members hear DHS for the Department of Homeland Security at the federal level, and then they also hear DSHS at the state level, and there's some confusion there. So if people seem confused about that, understand that those acronyms to a lot of people sound pretty similar, and they do vastly different things, right? So we got to be careful when we're explaining things. If you're talking about DSHS to somebody who just came in, remember that people might be confused about who we're talking about. We also have the Federal Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, that handles the immigration court system, and we're going to be talking about that system in a little bit. There's the immigration courts, and then there's an administrative appeal body called the Board of Immigration Appeals. And then finally, the Department of State has a lot of roles in immigration with people who are coming from abroad. You know, it's where you get visas, but it also, when we're trying to bring, when family members are trying to reunify, they're involved in the other country, and people interact with the Department of State. Now, I still hear people talk about INS. That was the agency that was in place for many, many years, handling immigration. I hate to break the news to those of you that did not know that INS is no longer with us. Rest in peace. INS was disbanded after the 9/11 attacks in 2002, and so all of its functions were kind of scattered to different agencies, most of them in DHS. So when you hear people say like INS came for them, they probably mean ICE because INS is no longer with us. All right, so let's get started in talking about the immigration system. Now, when we talk about immigration, I want to flag that we're going to be focusing most of our presentation on people who are not yet U.S. citizens. And so let's talk about who is a U.S. citizen. So people who are U.S. citizens are people who are born in the United States, who've now naturalized and gone through the entire process and have now achieved U.S. citizenship. There's also people who sometimes have acquired U.S. citizenship because they were born abroad, but their parents were U.S. citizens, and so there's special rules for that. So we're going to mostly focus on people who are not in that category. People who are already in the United States are not yet U.S. citizens. And when we talk about that group of people, there can be, if I showed you kind of like all the different immigration statuses that somebody could have, it would be this like huge chart of all these different types of immigration status. So I'm not going to bore you because I would put you to sleep very quickly. So we're going to talk about three big categories of people who are not yet U.S. citizens and who are present in the United States. Now, the first category are people that we call lawful permanent residents. Throughout the presentation, you might see LPR, lawful permanent residents. They're often called green card holders, and I'll talk about green cards in a minute. Now, that group is a group of people that have been given permission to live here and to work here indefinitely. And now, it says permanent, but I do want to flag that people can be deported even if they are lawful permanent residents. Primarily, that happens if people have been convicted of certain criminal offenses, or they can also be deemed to have abandoned their residence if they went abroad and started working and living somewhere else, and when they try to come back, the government can say, you've abandoned your permanent residence. So it is permanent, but not quite. Now, I put in, if you see in the presentation, I put people who are granted asylum and refugee status in this category. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those two things, but I'm going to put them in this category because both of those groups can quickly get lawful permanent residence, and they also get to stay here, again, in this kind of indefinite situation. So that's one group. Second group are people who are here on some sort of temporary status. Now, this is where it could be many different types of categories. It could be somebody who's here on a tourist visa, somebody who's on a student visa, who's on a temporary work visa. So there's different things that people can do depending on their immigration status. But the key point here is that there's some period of time that they have, or that they have to keep renewing their process. They're not here entitled to be here indefinitely on this temporary status. And then the third category, and the one that probably gets the most attention, are people who are undocumented. And people who are undocumented are people who are here in the United States, but who do not currently have permission to live or work in the United States. And that could be two groups. That could be people who came to the country without permission in the first place and haven't had an opportunity to legalize their status, or people who came initially in that second category of temporary status and now have overstayed. So it could be somebody who came on a tourist visa, was given permission to be here for 2 months, and is now here 3 years later. So even though they came in legally, they're now here undocumented because they don't have permission right now. Now, a quick word about undocumented. I want to acknowledge that there's, in the debate and in the conversation, a lot of people use other terms. They might use the phrase illegal immigrant, or more discouragingly for me, they might use the word illegal to describe people in that category. And I want to just quickly note about the reasons that I do not use that term in our organization. A lot of people, and we encourage people not to use terms involving illegal or illegal immigrant. And the reason for that is simply because the U.S. Constitution grants everybody in the United States basic constitutional protections. It's how our country got started, with the idea that everybody has basic rights. And so we believe very firmly that nobody is beyond the law. Nobody is somebody whose presence, whose being is unlawful. And so we don't, on a moral and principle ground, we don't believe people are illegal. And it's also important to note that, part of the work, a lot of the work that we do is to try to figure out a lot of people who are not currently have permission may actually qualify for a form of protection. So that's why we use the term undocumented when describing people who don't currently have permission. All right, let's keep going. So we talked about this category of people who have lawful permanent residence or green card. And so a big question that people ask us, both people who are here on temporary status or people who are undocumented, is how do I get to this magic, green card stage that will allow me to live here and stay in the United States? And so that's the question of how to get a green card. And I'm showing you what a green card used to look like. And this was already a source of confusion for people because it's not green. It's kind of this, it was this pink color. And so they're like, why is that's not a green card? People would say that's not a green card. Well, it was a green card. And the reason was because the green cards, originally the registration cards were actually a green color, and then immigration changed them to pink and made them pink for many years. But eventually, the name of green card had stuck, and everybody called them green cards. So a few years ago, immigration decided, I give up. We're just gonna make them green again. So the new green cards are green. You might still see some green cards that are pink, and you can see how it's really confusing already, the immigration system. All right, so how do we get a green card? Well, if you look at the numbers, this is the breakdown of, on an average year, I think I pulled these numbers from the last year that we have statistics for is 2015, is how many people get green cards in which categories. And about 2/3 of people who get green card status get it through a family member here in our country. Okay, so we're going to be exploring that category in more depth in a second. About 14% do it through employment. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about that too. And then 14% through either asylum or refugee status, and we'll get in more depth. And then, that as you can see, that doesn't add quite up to 100%. There's other categories that are more specific that will also allow people to get green cards to get permanent residence. I'll just quickly note one of those categories is something called the diversity visa lottery. And people will say, well, I heard that somebody told me that there was a lottery, and that's clearly a scam. I mean, there's no lottery for green cards. And I have to say, actually, that's one thing that sounds like a scam, but it's actually true. We do actually have a diversity visa lottery program that is basically structured to allow people who, but the key thing about the diversity visa lottery program is that it excludes the countries that send the most people to the United States, and so it's only for certain countries, and it's also difficult for people who are out of status to be able to pursue that program at this point. So anyway, I'm not going to talk more about that. I just want to mention that it is something real in case people have heard about it. So let's get into more depth about each of these categories. So how do people get a green card through a family member? So there's a process to petition people here, and I show you on the screen the different categories of people that can qualify to petition for somebody. So there's two categories of family members, of family relationships that would qualify. The first one is called the immediate category. And I want to flag that immediate is not what we understand to be like an immediate family member. Immediate was meant to convey the fact that this was a category that would not have a wait list, that could get the green cards pretty quickly. Except that in immigration law, immediate is like 9 months to a year. It still takes some time, but there's just not this like long wait list that I'll talk about in a minute. So the categories of relationships where it's in the immediate category are, if you're a U.S. citizen, you can petition for your spouse, you can petition for your child who's under 21, and then you can petition, if you are over 21, you can petition for your parent, if you're a U.S. citizen, okay? Now, there are other relationships where you can also start a process, but there's going to be a wait list. In immigration law, it's known as the preference categories, but preference makes it sound like it's like a good thing, right? Like that's good. And it's actually those relationships actually have a longer wait list. So that is, if you're a green card holder, lawful permanent resident, and you're petitioning for your spouse, your unmarried children, you can do that, or your adult children, married children, or siblings if you're a U.S. citizen, okay? And I'm going to get into a little bit more depth. Now, beyond those relationships that I just highlighted, you can't petition, okay? So sometimes people will come in and they'll say, my grandmother raised me. She's like a parent to me. And so can she petition for me? Because she's kind of like a parent, and I've heard parents can petition. No. I mean, just because the relationship was like that is not sufficient. Or my cousin, or my aunt, or my uncle. No, if they're not in the list of categories that I talked about, that's not going to be sufficient. Now, up until a few years ago, same-sex marriages were not recognized, but now under federal law, because of Supreme Court decisions now, same-sex marriages are recognized on the same basis as opposite-sex marriages, so that is being recognized right now. Now, a quick note. Sometimes people will say to me, well, I've heard that somebody needs a sponsor. And I want to clarify that issue because in family visa petitions, in these petitions, you need, first of all, you need somebody to petition. There needs to be one of these relationships, right? But on top of that, you need also somebody who is a financial sponsor. And basically, during the process, that person is saying, I am taking financial responsibility for this person who's coming in, and I have enough resources to support them financially. Now, most of the time, it's the same person who is petitioning. They act as the sponsor. But there are some situations where the person may not have the resources, and so they have to find somebody else who's willing to take that role on. The key thing is that sometimes people will come in and say, oh, I heard that there's a way that you can sponsor somebody to get a green card, right? And it's not quite true. They've heard about the sponsorship part, but you can't have the sponsorship without the petitioning, right? So you need to have the family relationship, and then you need to have the sponsor. You can't just do the sponsorship by itself. All right. So we talked about the wait list. And so, there's some relationships that don't have a wait list, but there are some that do. And I'm showing you here how long some of those wait lists can be. And it just all depends based on the relationship and the country that you're from, because we have different lines, essentially, for people. And so it's sometimes hard to explain this to people, but the way I try to do it is, this was a pretty popular event. So let's say that we had different doors and different lines for people to get in, depending on where you were from and what relationship you had. And so what this chart tells you, and it's something that's actually available online, it's called the Visa Bulletin, is if you go to the person who's about to get in, who's just coming in now, who's finally given their turn to come in, and you ask them, how long have you been waiting? And so if somebody comes into our office right now and says, I'm trying to bring in my sister, I'm a U.S. citizen, I'm trying to petition for my sister from the Philippines, and how long is it going to take? And I say, well, I can't tell you how long it's going to take for you. What I can tell you is that the person who filed for this has been waiting since August of 1993. That's how long people have been waiting. And so that's you can appreciate how long that is. And you can see some of the other dates on countries. So what happens is that people file this petition, and one of the things that also throws people off sometimes is that they file this petition, and they all of a sudden they realize that they get something, an approval notice from immigration, and so they get all excited. They're like, my petition has been approved. But all that means is that they basically have a turn in the line. They still have to wait until the petition becomes what immigration lawyers call current, meaning that they get up to that date. That's when the person actually is able to come to the United States or be able to get the green card. So sometimes people are having to wait for over 20 years in certain categories. And while the person is waiting in that line, if they're in the United States, that doesn't mean that they actually have permission to live here. So they still can get deported in that situation. Now, we talked about family. Let me tell you about employment. So employment is a way that people can get green cards, and that is true. But employment visas, as a practical matter, are only available to people who have either advanced educational degrees, or particular skills, or particular or very specialized things. So I'm overstating this, but fashion models, basketball players, baseball players, folks like in those categories may be able to, musicians, some people who are in certain categories where they specialized levels may be able to get green cards. If they have advanced degrees, might be able to get green cards. For folks who are working in what are traditionally sort of low-wage work, construction, agriculture, there's no realistic path to get a green card through those kind of employments. So for a lot of folks that certainly our organization is working with, employment visas are not really an option for folks in that situation. Now, the other big category that I talked about was asylum and refugee status, so let me explain that. So both of these types of immigration status, asylum and refugee status, are based on the principle and the idea and the concept that comes from international law, the Refugee Convention, that says that we are not going to send back to a country people who are going to be harmed in that country. So both of them are founded on that principle. Now, refugee status is something that somebody obtains before they come to the United States. So there's a refugee program that is handled outside of the United States. There are people who are refugees all around the world, and there is an entire program that I'm not going to be able to get into detail that will then try to place people in different countries. And there are many, many, many more people who want to be able to get relocated into the United States than we allow every year. The president gets to make the determination each year of how many people we allow in refugee status and from what regions. And one of the things that happened recently that I'll just quickly touch on is that, for example, President Obama had set a limit of 110,000 for this federal fiscal year, and President Trump, as soon as he came into office, he lowered that to 50,000. And the president gets to make that determination of how many people are allowed in via refugee status. So those are people that when they get to the United States, they already have that status. And once they come in with refugee status, after a year, they're eligible to apply for lawful permanent residence, which is why I put them in that category, because they have this right to be able to apply for lawful permanent residence. People who are granted asylum are people who apply for that when they already arrived to the United States. And they could be pursuing that. They could have come in without permission and applied for asylum. They could have been caught right at the border and applied for asylum. They could have come on a temporary visa and later applied for asylum. And so that's how asylum works. Now, one of the things that is important about this, that I want to explain about both of refugee and asylum protections, is that it is not sufficient merely to show that you are going to be harmed in your home country. So that is one component of it, that you're going to be persecuted, that you have a well-founded fear of persecution in your home country. You also have to establish that the reason you're going to be harmed is one of 5 things: political opinion, nationality, race or ethnicity, religion, or membership in a particular social group. So you could show that you are going to be harmed in your home country. For example, because there's just general violence in your home country, and everybody in your country might be harmed. But if the reason is simply that it's general strife, and it's not based on one of these 5 reasons, then you are going to be denied asylum or refugee protection. It has to be one of those 5 things. And there's a few things that you might say, well, I mean, so most of those are kind of pretty clear on what they are. Membership in a particular social group is I don't want to call it a catch-all, because that implies that it kind of covers everything. But there are some things that have been recognized. For example, sexual orientation, gender identity are being recognized. There's other categories of people who might fit into that criteria. It's a very case-by-case specific thing, and something that somebody needs to really review the case to figure out if they're going to qualify for protection. But the key thing is that sometimes we get people who come from regions, let's say parts of Mexico, other parts of the world where there's a lot of violence, and the person may be legitimately in fear about being sent back because there's a high risk that they may be harmed. One good example is Central America with gang violence, right? And there may be a lot of gang violence in the region, and the person may be legitimately concerned and may have a legitimate fear that they're going to be harmed if they go back there, or if they're sent back. But if it's not one of these categories, and oftentimes it might not be one of these categories, then the person may not ultimately qualify for protection. And that might be kind of counterintuitive for a lot of community members, because they might say, it's really terrible there. How could it possibly be that you don't get asylum? It's because our asylum law is much narrower than people realize. Now, one of the other things, for those of you that do work around, so for example, discrimination, and you see this list of categories, what seems to be missing? When you hear race, religion, nationality, when we think of discrimination, what's the other category? Gender, sex, right? Well, so that's not on the list, okay? So if you're being persecuted on account of your sex, that by itself is not sufficient reason to be granted asylum. Now, there's been some development of case law regarding the membership in a particular social group, where some claims, for example, of domestic violence survivors who could not get protection, who are in certain relationships, have been developed, but it's very case specific. And so that's another situation where we see a lot of claims that a lot of people would perceive as being able to get a protection that do not qualify. People who are granted asylum or refugee status also have a different path where they may be able to petition for spouses and minor children after they're granted that status. So that's a little bit of, it's kind of like a little special family visa petition for people in that group that I wanted to make sure and flag. Okay, so I want to jump back a little bit. So I've talked about the 3 main categories, and I want to talk a little bit about an important thing with regard to, that it mostly applies to family visa petitions, okay? And one of the key barriers, so I talked about the situation that a lot of people are able to get immigration status through their family and through a family member. But one of the things that I did not touch on yet is that that's not always enough. So there's a lot of barriers facing people who came to the United States without permission in the first place. I mentioned how somebody could be undocumented because they came into the country without permission or because they overstayed their visas. And so both of those people might be out of status. But the way that if somebody came in without permission, they have additional barriers to try to legalize their status. So let me explain how this works. So let's say a couple walks into our office and they say, I'm married to, so they come in and say, like, we're married, I'm a US citizen, and my wife is undocumented. And I've heard that as a US citizen, I can apply for her to get a green card. And so we'd like to start that process. And I'll say, yes, you're right. As a US citizen, you can petition for your spouse. But let me ask your wife how she came into the United States. And she says, well, I crossed the border without permission 15 years ago, and I am now, I'm here, and I've been here the whole time. And they say, okay, well, here's the thing, is that you can start the process, but because you came to the country without permission, you cannot get the green card here in the United States. You're not eligible for this, what immigration lawyers call adjustment of status, to adjust your status here in the US to become a lawful permanent resident and get your green card. You have to leave the country and get your green card outside the US. Now, a lot of people in that situation, they'll say, well, man, that's big because I have to travel, it's complicated, I have to pay, but okay, we can try to do that. And they'll say, well, but there's another wrinkle. You told me that you've been here now for 15 years without permission, and because of that, the moment you leave the country, you are barred from returning to the United States for 10 years. You are subject to something called in immigration law the 10-year bar. That's something that came into being in 1996. And so they say, well, wait a minute. You tell me, like, a whole point is that I want to legalize my status, but if I can't do it here, I have to leave the country, but if I leave the country, I'm stuck outside for 10 years? Yes. So that's one of the biggest barriers. There's a lot of people that have been put in this very much a catch-22 in terms of legalized status. The people who have this relationship where they can pursue this. Now, I want to flag, there is a waiver of the 10-year bar. So there is a way that you can ask the government to not keep you out for 10 years. Now, before 2013, you could only ask for the waiver after you left. So it was a big gamble, right? You had to leave the country and then ask, will you let me back in before the 10 years, and hope for the best. Needless to say, a lot of people decided not to do that because they didn't want to take the chance. One of the reforms that President Obama launched in 2013 was to create this program called the provisional waiver that allows people to apply for the waiver before they leave. So they have some certain, well, I don't want to say certainty, but they have some sense of whether they're going to be allowed back in. So that reform has been operating, and it's allowing people to do that. And, it's not an easy waiver to get, but it's also not impossible, and so people can pursue this, and a lot of people are being able to do this to get the green cards in situations that they wouldn't have otherwise. But it's still a pretty complicated and expensive process, and people really need good advice in trying to navigate this process, because we've seen way too many cases where the people have left and they've ended up stuck outside. And that's another thing, that's one of the things that could potentially, go away under the new administration. Currently, it's still in place, but I do want to flag that it's something that the new administration could try to take away. So that's this issue of adjustment of status is a big reason, it's a big barrier for a lot of people who would otherwise have an ability to be able to legalize their status. Okay, so if people have managed to get to the green card stage, once they get to green card stage, what happens? Can they apply for citizenship? Yes. And now the U.S. does not, there's some countries where they don't allow you to be in the equivalent of green card stage for too long. They force you to decide whether to become a citizen or you have to leave. We do not do that. And so there's a lot of people in the United States who stay on green card stage for a long time. You have to renew your green card every 10 years, but there's no requirement that you become a citizen. However, people can become citizens. The general rule is that you can become a citizen after 5 years. People who are married to U.S. citizens, the timeline gets reduced to 3. Now, you have to meet other requirements that I'm not going to get into about how much time you've lived here. You could be disqualified by certain criminal convictions and other issues, but that's the general rule. Now, I think it's very important, and we've seen, with the travel ban that I'll be talking a little bit more later, some of the benefits of having citizenship, and of course, there's all kinds of benefits. The fact that people can vote, participate fully, they don't have to worry about their permanent residence being taken away. So there's a lot of reasons that we encourage and we think people should become U.S. citizens. However, it's also important that when they do make that decision, that they make sure and get good advice to make sure that the application for citizenship is not going to lead to adverse consequences. Because sometimes we have lawful permanent residents who had a problem, particularly problems with the criminal justice system years ago, that wasn't an issue then, but may be an issue now. So somebody might be a lawful permanent resident who had a drug conviction 15, 20 years ago that back then never got flagged. And all of a sudden, when they apply for citizenship, it becomes an issue and could actually lead to somebody being placed in deportation proceedings because you can lose your permanent residence based on that. So again, I'm not trying to discourage people from applying for permanent residence because it's important for people to get citizenship and get that protection, but it's just important that people make sure that they get good advice and get screened by an immigration attorney or an accredited representative to make sure that they are not going to get in trouble when they're pursuing citizenship. All right. So sometimes people will say, I know I don't qualify for permanent residence. I know I don't qualify. All I want is just a work permit. I've heard that you can just apply for a work permit, and that's all I need. I just want a social security number so I can work here legally. Can I apply for one of those? And the problem is that there's not a way to simply just apply for a work permit because you want to. There are a number of situations where somebody qualifies for a particular form of immigration status that makes you eligible to apply for a work permit. But there isn't just a standalone way that you can apply for a work permit if you don't currently have immigration status. So we're going to talk about some of these protections. We'll talk about the U visa and the DACA program for Dreamers and a few other things where you can apply. And sometimes when you're in the process of applying for a green card, you can get a temporary work authorization. But the key thing that I want to emphasize is that there isn't just a separate path to apply for a work permit just because. Now, when you get the work permit, you can get a Social Security number associated with it. Oftentimes, the Social Security card will say only valid with employment authorization, so that it's only tied to your work permit. And the Social Security number by itself isn't evidence that you have permission to work forever. It's the work permit that actually authorizes you to work. So I'll just touch on that quickly. So let me just quickly show you this chart because I want to explain again this issue, because this is the part that kind of confuses a lot of folks about how family visa petitions, which is, again, I think one of the main ways that people can get immigration status in the U.S. So the first question that people have to ask is, am I even eligible to apply for somebody? Do I have one of these relationships that I can qualify to get to petition for them? Let's say the answer is yes. Okay, well then the next question is, and I filed a petition. The next question is there a wait list? And so I might file the petition, but then be stuck on this wait list for decades before I can even move to the next stage. Okay, if you are married to a U.S. citizen, if it's through a U.S. citizenship relationship, a spouse of a U.S. citizen, you won't have the wait list. But if you are a sibling trying to petition for your sibling from another country, you will have to wait in the wait list. So let's say it's a spouse, so you don't have to wait, so you can move to the next stage. Okay, so then the next question is the other person already in the U.S.? If they're in the U.S., then You go to that stage, and then the question is, okay, are you eligible to adjust status? Are you able to get the green card here because you came in with permission or not? If you came in with legally with a visa, then you can adjust the status and you can do the processing here. If you do not qualify to adjust your status, you're going to have to leave the country, and then there's the question about whether you're going to be subject to one of those bars that is going to prevent you from doing it, and you're going to have to apply for a waiver and decide whether you want to take the risk of leaving the country. Now, if the person is outside the U.S., obviously they're going to have to go through the processing outside the United States. So that's the pathway that people have to follow to be able to get a green card through family relationships. Now, I've spent some time talking about how people can get green cards. So let me talk about the ways that are not necessarily a path to get green cards, but that a lot of people think might be paths to get green cards. So people who came to the United States at a young age. So I've had to sit in the Tacoma Detention Center representing and talking to somebody who, when I asked her, when I was doing the intake and I was asking her, how long have you been in the United States? She told me she said, I don't remember, but my mom tells me that I was 8 months old when she carried me as a baby across the border. And that's all I remember. I mean, that's all I know, because since I remember, I've been in the United States. And she was 19 when I talked to her at the detention center. And unfortunately, this was in 2007, and after I completed the intake, there was no option for her. She was ultimately deported because there's no law currently, and still no law currently, that says that just because you came here at a very young age and you've lived your entire life in the United States, that you can get a green card or lawful permanent residence. There's been a proposal in Congress for many years known as the DREAM Act that has been introduced in every session since, I think, at least 1999, but that unfortunately has never passed Congress. And so that it remains a proposal, and therefore, under our immigration laws, the fact that you came at a very young age does not mean that you can get a green card. Now, as some of you may know, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail, President Obama launched a program in 2012 that provides some temporary relief to people in those situations known as the DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and I'll get into more detail about that program later. So there is a temporary program that provides temporary protection, but it's still not green card, right? You still can't get a green card that way under current law. Maybe I've lived in the United States for a long time. And so I've done intakes with people who tell me I've been in the United States for 32 years. I'm undocumented. And I've been here for over 30 years. And, is there some program for me because I've lived here for that long? No. The fact that you've lived here for that long does not mean that you're going to get a green card, right? You still have to have in order to do that, you need to have one of the categories that I talked about before. Having U.S. citizen children under the age of 21. So that's another one. And sometimes you hear that in the news where they say, oh, people come here, have babies here, and that, allows them to stay. Well, my response to that is, it's a very inefficient way to get immigration status. Because here's how it would work. So if that's the way you're going to try to get a lawful permanent residence, here's what you'd have to do. You have to come to the United States, you have to have a baby, okay? You have to wait until they're 21 years old, then they can petition for you, right? But if you came to the United States without permission, you're subject to the 10-year bars. You're not eligible to adjust, right? So you can't get the green card here. So then you have to leave the country to get your green card. And when you leave the country, you're subject to the 10-year bar because you've been undocumented that whole time. And you can't get a waiver in that situation when you're being petitioned through your child if you're not married to a U.S. citizen. And so you're basically looking at, when the kid is 31 years of age, at potentially getting a green card then. And so, like I said, I think that's a pretty inefficient way to be able to get lawful permanent residence. So that's not really that. Now, the other question that we get is, being a very committed worker. So oftentimes we get employers to come to our office and say, a guy I work with just got detained. He's at the detention center, and he's like runs my business. He's the foreman of my landscaping crew, and he's essential for my business. Surely that must count for something. No, I mean that's not going to be it counts for something, but not for a green card. That's not going to be enough to do that. Now the other thing is people ask us, having a serious medical condition. If I have a serious medical condition, can I get a green card that way? No. There is no humanitarian program that says that because you have a serious medical condition, you're going to be allowed to stay. If my child has a serious medical condition, there's a little bit of a wrinkle in this one. There is sometimes people have said, like, I've heard that if you have a child with a serious medical condition, you might be able to stay. There is a form of protection, defensive thing when you're in deportation proceedings. Is known as it's often referred to as 10-year cancellation of removal. You can only apply for it once you're already in a deportation process, which allows you to ask a judge to not deport you based on the fact that you have 10 years, at least 10 years in the United States, and that either your child, your spouse, or your parent who's a U.S. citizen or permanent resident is going to suffer exceptional and extremely unusual hardship if you get deported. It used to just say extreme hardship, but then Congress felt like they were giving it away too easily, and so they changed the language to say exceptional, extremely unusual hardship. Because basically, a lot of people who are in that situation, they'll say, hey, I have 10 years, and if you deport me, that's going to be a really bad hardship for my kid, right? I mean, just any time that you get separated from your parent is going to be like really bad. And they say, no, that's just normal hardship. Because in deportation processes, that happen all the time. And so it's only in situations where you can demonstrate that it's unusual, it's out of the norm. And so oftentimes in situations where the child or the spouse has a serious medical condition or something else that requires specialized treatment, that is going to be hard to do elsewhere. All right. So we got through that first section. Let's talk about removal and deportation proceedings. Now, why do I use the word removal? That is the formal name of this process now in immigration court. Up to 1996, they used the terms deportation and exclusion, but I guess they felt that was like too harsh, and so they changed the name. Now, we're not deporting you, we're just removing you from the country. Gently, we're removing you. But it's the same thing. It's deportation. So I'll kind of use the terms interchangeably. So what is this deportation process? So this deportation process is a way that the government is trying to decide if you should be kicked out of the country. And there are basically two questions that get asked in a deportation case. The first question is this person somebody who is subject to deportation? And the second question is, even if it is somebody who is normally subject to deportation, is there a defensive strategy, a protection that they qualify to be allowed to stay in the United States? So let me explain that in more detail. So the first question is, if you're a U.S. citizen, you shouldn't be deported, right? And most people think, well, that's easy, right? We know who are U.S. citizens. Well, let me tell you about one of our clients. His name is Redison Castillo. Redison was born in Belize. He came to the United States when he was about 6 years old, and he became a lawful permanent resident through his family, lived here, eventually served in the U.S. Army, and then he became a U.S. citizen while he was in the Army. In fact, the Army told him that he couldn't stay in the Army unless he became a U.S. citizen, so he became a U.S. citizen. And later, after he left the Army, he was arrested in Pierce County, and then he was told as he was being released from the Pierce County jail that he was being transferred to the Northwest Detention Center. And he was like, that immigration was going to pick him up. And he said, why is immigration picking me up? I'm a U.S. citizen. They're like, I don't know, talk to them. And so when he got to the detention center, he kept asking. He's like, I shouldn't be here. I'm a U.S. citizen. They're like, we don't see anything on your record that you're a U.S. citizen. Talk to the judge. So he finally had his hearing. And he had his hearing without a lawyer. I'll explain in a minute. And he kept saying, I'm a U.S. citizen. I served in the Army. And the judge is like, we don't have any record of you being a U.S. citizen. Where are your citizenship documents? And he's like, I don't know, maybe at home, but I don't have anybody who can get them. And he's like, well, you admit that you were born in Belize. And he said, yes. And he said, well, then it's your burden to prove that you're a U.S. citizen. And if you can't prove it, you're going to be ordered deported. And he could. So the immigration judge ordered him deported. He filed an appeal on his own. We actually got involved in his case while he was on appeal, and finally were able to get the military records that ultimately showed that what had happened was that immigration, for some reason, had created 2 different files for him. And they had one file that had nothing on it other than he was born in Belize, and the other file had all of his lawful permanent residence and citizenship information. And when they detained them, they just looked at one file, and they never saw the other file. And so when finally we pointed that out and we showed the other file number, they're like, oh yeah, it's true. Except that it took 8 months while he was detained for that to happen. So anyway, he was I don't want to say lucky, but he was eventually released after that. So that question of whether you're a U.S. citizen is actually not as simple sometimes as people might believe. There's also situations where people are lawful permanent residents, and the government is saying you committed a criminal offense that makes you deportable. And that's oftentimes not clear. And so that first question can be very important. But let's say it's somebody who's undocumented, who doesn't have current permission. So the answer to that first question may be yes. They are undocumented, they don't have permission to be here, so they could be subject to deportation. So then we move to the second question, which is there a protection for which they qualify? And that could be a number of things. It could be they qualify, they can pursue asylum. They can pursue, maybe they have a family relationship. Maybe they're married to a U.S. citizen and they're eligible to adjust their status here. Maybe they're eligible for this cancellation or removal that I talked about, the 10-year cancellation. So there's a process that the court would have to go through to decide whether they are eligible for that and whether they get to stay. So that's what the deportation proceedings are about. Now, one key thing that I want to talk about is that sometimes people get detained and they don't get a hearing before the immigration judge. And so there are some situations where people are going to be detained by immigration and they're not entitled to a hearing before the immigration judge. Generally, it's people who either just arrived to the United States at the border or people who've had prior deportations in the past. And maybe who were deported before, now they come back. They're not necessarily entitled to an immigration court hearing. And so there are situations where that can happen. Now, how do people end up in this process? So many different paths, and some of these paths are sort of changing. One of the biggest ways that people end up in the deportation process is interactions with the criminal justice system. So they are arrested by local law enforcement for some reason, and they end up in the scope of immigration. Now, I do want to flag, and I'll talk a little bit about this more later, that one of the reasons is because the fingerprint databases have now been connected. And so when people are arrested and their fingerprints are taken, that information ultimately, through the FBI, is shared with ICE. And it's not necessarily a decision of the local governments, I want to emphasize, okay? But just because everybody's checking against the FBI database, the information ends up being shared with ICE, and that, if the person's fingerprints are in the database, that gets flagged for people. And so that's one big significant way that people are identified. Filing an application that is denied. So remember I talked to you about this couple who wanted to apply for citizenship. Let's say they didn't go to an immigration attorney. They just had heard that a U.S. citizen can apply for the spouse, and so they say, hey, let's just do it ourselves, right? And so I'll apply for a spouse. I'll file the paperwork. I can download it from the internet. And it all looks good. They file the application. They get an interview notice, and they're thinking that everything's working right. They go to the interview, and the USCIS officer says, well, let's see. It says here that you came to the country without permission. And the woman says, yes. They say, okay, well, you're not eligible for adjustment of status. You can't get your green card here. You're married to a citizen, but you have to go through consular processing. And she's like, oh, I didn't know that. Yes, well, but now I know that you're here undocumented, so I'm going to refer your case to ICE, and you're going to be placed in deportation proceedings. Because before, immigration may not have known that they were here, but now that she's filed this application, they do. People apply for asylum, and they get denied by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That also will go to that may go to deportation proceedings. Now, this is something that has changed because under the Obama administration, the person in that situation, when they're married to a U.S. citizen, if they didn't have a record, it's likely that they would not have been referred to ICE, okay? But under this new administration, I think it's very likely that they would be referred to ICE. So people have to understand that there's a heightened risk in those situations. Now, we also see other interactions with ICE and Border Patrol. So I mentioned that for example, one of the groups that they're going after right now that immigration is actively looking for are people with prior deportation orders. And, you know, that sounds kind of bad in a lot of situations. People say, well, you know, they were previously deported, you know, that sounds like they're like bad people. Well, you know, I think what happens a lot is like the people who have the biggest ties are the people who come back. So somebody's been living here for 10, 20, 15 years, undocumented. They get caught up with immigration, they're deported, but their entire family is here. Guess what happens? A lot of them decide to come back again, and now they have this prior deportation order, and immigration is actively looking for them. And so what's happening frequently now in our communities under the new administration, and what's happening to a lesser extent even under the Obama administration, is that ICE will go look for them and identify them. They run their names through different databases and will identify them, and so they'll go looking. And so they say, oh, Jorge Barón has a deportation order. We're going to go find them, right? Now, under the Obama administration, they would have just picked up Jorge and taken him away. But under this new administration, what we're seeing in the past few weeks is that they'll go to Jorge's house, they'll detain Jorge, and they'll also start questioning everybody else who's in the house, who happens to be there. And if any of them admit to being undocumented, then they'll pick them up too. And that's happening very frequently. Right now we're seeing situations where the Border Patrol is checking documents at bus stations. In Spokane is where we've seen it more frequently. So they're checking documents. If the person admits that they're not here without permission, they're going to be placed in deportation proceedings. We are expecting that we might see things like workplace raids later, where people are detained at their workplace. That's how they might end up in deportation proceedings. So there's just a number of ways that people might end up in those situations. Now, when people are placed in these proceedings, in deportation proceedings, immigration has some discretion in some cases to detain or not detain the person. So they could give them a notice to appear in court here in Seattle, but more and more frequently, what we see is that people do get detained at the Northwest Detention Center. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. So where does this deportation process happen? It happens in immigration court. There are 2 immigration courts in our area, in Seattle and Tacoma, in our state. If you're not detained, you go to court in Seattle. If you are detained, it's in the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. And one of the key challenges is that people do not have the right to an appointed attorney in immigration court. So this is not like a criminal case where if you can't afford an attorney, you will be provided one. And so this is kind of what it looks like in the immigration court. And you see that there's a judge with black robe, and on the one side it's the government attorney, who's the prosecutor, who's making the case for why the person should be deported, and on the other there's a table. And if you have the resources and can hire a private attorney, then you can bring your attorney and have him or her represent you. But if you don't, then you're going to be representing yourself. And the statistics are pretty bad. If you're in Seattle, about 35% of cases are unrepresented, but if you're in Tacoma, the detention center, about 92% of the cases in a 5-year period were unrepresented, meaning that they had to proceed on their own and try to make the case themselves. Now, they do give people, if they don't have a lawyer, they will provide them a list of free legal services providers in Tacoma it does have 3 different listings there. Unfortunately, it's our Tacoma office, our Seattle office, and our Granger office, so it's really just us on that list. But it is plural, so there are providers. It just happens to be the same organization. So that's the Northwest Detention Center. The Northwest Detention Center is a private facility. I want to just quickly tell you it's a private facility. It's run by a corporation named the Geo Group. That is an international corporation that runs detention centers, not only here in the US, but also in Australia and the UK and a number of other places. It's in the Port of Tacoma area. A lot of people sometimes even in the Tacoma area don't know where it is. It's expanded as we speak here this evening. There's about over 1,500 community members who are detained. Some of them, right now, it's a mix of people from the border, from the southern border, who are brought up here for their deportation case, and then people from the local community. I think what we expect is we're going to see more and more people from the local community, and then they're going to detain the asylum seekers down in the south. There's the immigration court within the facility. The government attorneys are there, and then the geo group guards that run the facility are there. This is a little bit what the detention center looks there. Oftentimes people ask us about the conditions are. I think what we hear from a lot of community members is that it's very cramped. It's this kind of big dorm, like dorm areas where they have a lot of bunks and not a lot of privacy, and people are really concerned. And one of the things that's really difficult is for people who are fighting their case is that they don't know how long they're going to be detained. I had one client who was there detained for over 4 years in this detention center. Now, some people get, if they're not fighting their case, they may get processed very quickly. If they had a prior deportation order, they may get processed even more quickly. But that's one of the big challenges with people in the detention center. Now, people who end up detained are going to end up leaving the detention center one of a few ways. So they will get deported. They will get a removal order, and they will get sent back. They usually get driven to, depends on where they're from. If they're from Mexico or Latin America, they generally get sent by plane from the detention center. They get taken to Boeing Field, where their plane takes them to the southern border, and then they either get bussed across the border, or they get transferred to another plane that takes them, for example, to Central America. The voluntary departure is something that people who are in detention might get, but it still means that they get kicked out. It's just on the record. It's not going to show up as a deportation. There are ways that some people can ask the judge to release them on bond if they pay a certain amount. Not everybody's going to have that, but some people do get the opportunity to do that and can get released. Now, that just means that they're going to continue their deportation case in the non-detained docket in Seattle or somewhere else if they go there. In some cases, people can be paroled. If they're asylum seekers, they can be granted something called parole. I think one of the things the new administration has said is that they're not going to do that very frequently, and so we're going to see less of that. Or they may be granted some form of protection, right? They may be granted asylum, they may be granted cancellation removal, adjustment of status, or something else, and they're able to stay here in the United States and they get released. So that's a quick overview of detention and deportation. So let's talk about some protections for certain vulnerable populations. And again, I want to emphasize that these protections don't apply to a large number of people, but I still want to make sure, and I see vulnerable is not spelled correctly, oh boy. All right, so now there's protections under VAWA, under the Violence Against Women Act, one situation that we have, if you think about it, we talked a lot about how family relationships are one of the main ways that people can get immigration status. And one of the problems that developed over time and still continues to be a problem is that particularly in spousal relationships, that becomes a big problem if there's any kind of domestic violence or abuse. Because let's say I'm the U.S. citizen and my wife is undocumented or only has temporary status, and I can petition for her to get a green card, right? But let's say I'm abusive towards her. And then it's my petition, right? I decide whether I file a petition. She can't just do it on her own most of the time. I mean, the normal rule is that they can't do that. And so I have total control over the petition. And I can tell her, if you call the police, I won't file for you. Or if I file something for you, I'll withdraw it. And I'll call immigration to get you deported. And so, unfortunately, that's a situation that happened and continues to happen. And so Congress decided to create a protection to try to counter that kind of situation, and it's called the VAWA self-petition. What it says is that if you are in one of those relationships where you could petition for somebody, if you are, it's most of the time we see it in spouses, but it also applies for children, that the person who would be eligible to get a green card can apply on their own if they can demonstrate that the person who would normally petition for them is abusive. So if the spouse is being abusive and you can demonstrate that, then the person can just self-petition to get a green card. That way they can leave the abusive relationship and not have to depend on that person. Now, a key thing is that it needs to be then a relationship that would have normally qualified to get petitioning. So that people need to be married and need to be, the person who's the abuser needs to have been a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. But one of the things about this protection is that you do not, it's not required that the person have reported the incident to the police. I mean, if the police have been involved, that could be good evidence for the case, but it's not a requirement. And if you get approved for that, you can obtain green card status. You can get lawful permanent residence. Now, if you, there's another form of protection that is known as the U visa. And before you start trying to figure out why is it the U, it's just that our immigration laws, where it categorizes all the visas, it goes by, the paragraphs. And so it started with A's and B's, and by the time they created the U visa, we were down to the U's. So don't try to figure anything out. It's not anything important. It's just that it's down at the end of the alphabet. I can tell you the next visa that gets created, we're down to V, so the next one for sure is going to be W. All right, so U visa is a form of protection that Congress created in 2000 to protect people who are victims of serious crimes here in the United States. There's a number of crimes that are listed. It includes the things that we see most frequently are domestic violence, sexual assault, kidnapping, felony assault. There's a number of different things that could qualify. And the person needs to have shown this, they suffered substantial physical or mental abuse. So sometimes people say, like, somebody stole my car, I'm a victim of crime, can I qualify for the U visa? No. You are a victim of crime, but that's not one of the categories. So you need to have suffered a substantial physical and mental abuse. And then the other key thing, and sometimes can be the difficult thing, is that the person needs to be able to show that they were helpful or have been helpful or will be helpful in the investigation or prosecution of a criminal offense. And in order to do that, they need to be able to get a certification from a law enforcement or prosecuting agency in the case. And that is sometimes challenging because there are sometimes situations where the law enforcement agency does not want to give that certification. And without that certification, you cannot move forward with a U visa case, unfortunately. And so that is a very important, so there does need to be some sort of investigation or prosecution. Now, it doesn't mean that the person needs to have been convicted, the person who did the crime. It could be that there was an investigation and the person did all they could, but there was no conviction. That's okay. As long as the law enforcement agency is willing to certify. The difference here is that you don't have to have a relationship with the person who committed the abuse or anything like that, like there is in the other context, but you do need that certification. And one thing that I do want to flag, there are some, most of the time, the person who suffered the direct victim is the person who can qualify, but there are situations where somebody who's not the direct victim can qualify. Most frequently, what we see is a situation, for example, where there's a victim who is a small child or a U.S. citizen child, and the parent's undocumented. If the parent has information that they're providing to the local enforcement, even though they themselves were not the direct victim of, say, child abuse or child sex abuse, they could be eligible for a U visa in that situation. So it's a pretty, with a lot of these things, our goal here is not to try to get you to be doing the intake and screening, which I hope is not what you were thinking you're here to do, but just so that if you hear situations like that, you know that there is protection for folks in these circumstances. All right. I talked about asylum and withholding of asylum before. Again, this is a protection for people who are in danger in their home countries for one of the reasons that we talked about. One of the key things is that asylum generally is only available for people who came, who can apply in the first year of being in the United States. So it's really important that people who think that they want to pursue asylum, that they do soon after they arrive, because the window may close afterwards. After that year, there's some exceptions to the one-year rule, like for children under 18, and when circumstances have changed. If people haven't applied for asylum and they're in a deportation process, that they're not eligible for asylum, they could apply for something called withholding of removal, which is similar to asylum, a little bit harder to get, and doesn't give you permanent status. So that's that form of protection, and there's also a form of protection on the Convention Against Torture if the person is likely to be tortured when they get back. There's also protection for children who've been abused, abandoned, and neglected. It's known as special immigrant juvenile status. If you have anybody who's under 18 and undocumented and who has been abused, abandoned, or neglected, it's something important to consider for somebody in that situation. And then there are other forms of protection. There's protection for victims of human trafficking, the T visa. That one just happened to match up. The T happened to match up with trafficking, but it's also, it just happens to be in the T. There's also a program called temporary protected status that sometimes people have heard about, and they tell me, I've heard that some people from certain countries are able to stay in the United States, and yes, there's a grain of truth to that. So this temporary protected status is a program that is in the immigration laws that say that the President and Secretary of Homeland Security can designate countries where there's been kind of a humanitarian crisis. And basically what it means is that the people who are already in the United States at a certain moment are allowed to stay temporarily because we don't want to deport people to that country while it's in a difficult situation. So as a good example, Haiti, when they had their earthquake, we designated the Homeland Security designated Haiti for temporary protected status, and that meant that the people who were from Haiti, who were here, who maybe were undocumented or were here on temporary status only, they were allowed to apply for this temporary protected status so that they could stay here and we wouldn't be sending back to a place that is unstable. Now, it doesn't mean that the people who were not in the United States at that moment get to stay. If somebody comes, they can still be deported because they weren't here at the time that it was designated, or if they didn't apply at the time. So you see a few of the dates for certain countries that currently have that designation right now. All right, so let's talk about some of the stuff that you probably came to hear. Developments under the new administration. Makes it sound so pleasant. All right. Unfortunately, for most of us, it's not pleasant. Let me start talking. One of the first questions that a lot of people asked us after the election was about what's going to happen to this Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, for the DACA program. And I want to just quickly, I bet a lot of you know about this program, but I just quickly want to give some background about what it is. I mentioned it. It's a program that President Obama launched in 2012 to provide protection. It was after the last big attempt for the DREAM Act failed in 2010 in Congress. And so there was a lot of pressure put on President Obama. And in June 2012, he announced this program. And he said that people who meet certain criteria can then apply to get granted this immigration status, quasi-immigration status, that allows them to get a work permit and a Social Security number. And basically, the government is saying to them, we know you're here, we're not going to deport you. And the qualifications that you see on the screen are the person must have entered the U.S. before the age of 16. They've lived in the United States since June 15, 2007. And then they have other requirements that they have to meet. And, at the time, this is not a law. It was an executive action that the president took. And one of the questions that we had at the time was, are people going to pursue this? Because this actually happened right before the 2012 election. And there's certainly a lot of people applied. I can show you the numbers. Nationally, as of September of last year, which is the latest figures that are available, there were over 752,000 people in the country who have been approved for the DACA program, and here in Washington it was over 17,000 people. And so the question that people have been asking us is what could happen? And so there were kind of 4 different scenarios that could happen. The program could be terminated completely and the work permits taken away. The program could be terminated, but the work permits would just be allowed to expire. The program could be, people could be grandfathered in. People who had already applied could be kept in, or the program could just continue running without any problem. And that's kind of where we are right now. So it's been a month and a half. For those of you that are watching the recording, it's March 2nd. And as of this moment, the DACA program continues. They're still approving applications. They're still approving renewal applications. The administration had said, and the president during his campaign said that he was going to terminate this program, and there has not been any clear indication that they're definitely going to keep it. So there is still a lot of uncertainty about it. So what people have asked us is like, well, are they going to come out after the people who apply for DACA? I think that, there's not, even if the administration ultimately decides to terminate the program, I don't think that there's going to be a broad sweep of people who have DACA. Because, and I hope many of you understand that the reason that people are afraid of that is because unlike a lot of undocumented people, this was people who applied and gave their address, their fingerprints, they had all their information. And so there's a lot of reasons why people have been afraid of this happening, because they had so much information about them. I still think that even if they do decide at some point to terminate the program, that the risk of them trying to pick everybody up who had DACA is relatively low. Now, there are going to be some people who are going to be at greater risk. People who had prior deportations, people who have criminal convictions, and anybody who comes into contact with the criminal justice system. And as I'm sure all of you know, there's a local case where exactly that situation happened, and immigration, in my opinion, has taken has looked at somebody who has a tattoo and decided they're a danger to the community, and so we're going to go after them. So clearly, DACA is not as protective as it was, 6 weeks ago. And there are some problems that we're having right now. But I also want to sort of reassure people who have DACA that we don't necessarily see that case as an indication that they're going to come out after everybody. So what are we telling people right now for folks who have DACA status or who are considering applying? It's a little tricky. But our general message has been that people who already are in the program, they've already provided their information. They've already come out and told the government who they are and given their information. So if they haven't had problems with the criminal justice system, if they haven't traveled without permission, if they don't have any other issues, then we do think that they should continue renewing or pursuing renewal of their DACA status. Okay? It gets a little bit more complicated for the people who never applied for DACA, right? Because they are not in the system. Immigration does not know they're here. And so for them, it's a little bit more of a risky proposition because they may be putting themselves out there and the program could be ended really any time. And so we are encouraging people to talk to an attorney to assess their situation and for them to make a decision as to whether they should pursue it or not based on their individual situation at this point until we get a clear message from the administration on which way they want to go. So that's DACA. Now, there are things, so that one, nothing has happened in a sense. There's other things that have happened with regard to the administration, and that has been a number of executive orders that the president has announced. The first sort of round of executive orders happened on January 25th, and the president announced one that had to do with interior enforcement and one that had to do with border security. And then since then, a couple of weeks ago, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, issued memos regarding those things. And this might be one of those slides that might not be proper in your thing. So I want to flag that this is where some of your printed materials may not match up with what we have here. Sorry about that. So the January 25th, basically, there's a lot to talk about with those executive orders. The executive orders by themselves did not change the law, but what they did is they changed the way that immigration was approaching enforcement. And President Obama, it took a while, but President Obama eventually had placed some limits on the people who would be subjected to immigration enforcement and detained and placed in deportation proceedings. And so towards the tail end of his administration, a lot of people who didn't have criminal records and who have not arrived recently had been at relatively low risk of being placed in deportation proceedings because they just were not considered priorities. Now, in these executive orders, President Trump said, we're going to expand the priorities, and in my opinion, he's expanded them in such a way that effectively everybody's a priority. Because he has said, people who have any kind of criminal conviction, who've been arrested and charged with a criminal conviction, anybody who, in the judgment of an immigration officer, could be a threat to public safety, and then anybody who has committed any acts which could be considered a criminal conviction. And, for example, crossing the border without permission is technically a misdemeanor. And so anybody who did that is a priority, which is majority of undocumented people. So really anybody. And at the same time, he said, and even if you're a priority, even if you're not a priority, you could still, we're not putting anybody outside the scope of deportation. So the way that that's playing out on the ground level is that basically any encounter that anybody has with immigration could lead to them being in deportation proceedings, which is a significant change from what we were seeing a few weeks ago, before January 20th. So that's a significant change, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a minute, about what we can do regarding that. The other executive order that probably got even more attention a couple of days later, and that maybe overshadowed the other two, was the executive order that the president issued on January 27th, which imposed a travel ban and some suspension of the refugee program. So he suspended the refugee program for 120 days for all countries, indefinitely for Syria, reduced the refugee program for this fiscal year, and then he placed this temporary ban on travel from people who are from 7 countries, predominantly Muslim countries, at the time. And of course, many of you know that then chaos ensued that weekend. People were caught in the middle, literally, while they were flying to the U.S. when this order was imposed, and were turned around, and they tried to deport them. Some of them were deported when they arrived. And then a week later, thanks to some litigation that was filed by our State Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, that's right, a federal judge right a few blocks from here blocked that program, that executive order, most of that executive order. It did not block the lowering of the refugee limits, but it placed that travel ban and the most of the executive order on hold. And so that's been suspended since that time. That was appealed. The Court of Appeals upheld that decision. And what the administration has said is that they're no longer going to fight that case, but that they are going to issue a new executive order that is going to have probably similar impact, or attempt to have a similar impact. And as of right now, March 2nd, it hasn't been issued yet, so I can't tell you what it's going to say. I have a suspicion that it will actually happen tomorrow. So we will have to wait to see what happens with that. I am fairly confident that there will be litigation around whatever the president announces, and so we'll have to see how those developments happen. What are we telling people? So people from those countries, our message has been difficult to sort of explain because things have been moving so fast. I will tell you that even now, without the new travel ban, we have been telling people who are from those 7 countries that if they're not U.S. citizens or permanent residents of the United States, if they're on some sort of temporary visa, for example, and they're in the United States, that we are discouraging them from leaving the United States, at least until they've talked to an attorney and figure out what their risks are, and have really considered that decision, because they may not be allowed back in the future. People have asked me, if I'm a naturalized citizen from one of those 7 countries, should I worry? I won't put anything. I won't put past this administration trying to do anything. But a U.S. citizen cannot be prevented from coming back to the United States. So they might hassle you at the airport. You might get questioning, but you should not. We do not think that people should not travel. I would say the same thing to a permanent resident from one of those 7 countries, except that for all permanent residents, I will say that you have to be careful, understand that if you have certain, if you've had certain problems, for example, if you had problems with the criminal justice system, or since you became a permanent resident, you lived outside the United States for longer than 6 months, you should talk to an attorney before you travel. That goes for any country, not just the people in the travel ban. But certainly, if you're one of those 7 countries, you're definitely going to get questions. So you definitely want to talk to somebody before you travel to make sure there's no risks in your situations. So that's where we are with the executive orders. I'm sure we'll take some questions on those. People have asked us, well, you know, are there going to be changes to all these other protections? Like, can the president take away asylum? Can they take out U visas? Can they do other things? No, the president can't undo those protections because they're written into the law. Only Congress can take those away. So the president can't undo that, but there are some things that people need to consider when they're applying. There will be an increase, there is going to be, and there already is, an increased risk if you apply for something that if you get denied, you might be placed in deportation proceedings. Because if you're without status and you apply for a benefit, you are putting yourself out there, and that might lead to a higher risk. If you get denied, then you might be placed in deportation proceedings. Now, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't pursue these protections, I want to emphasize, because understand that there's risk. There's also a heightened risk of doing nothing, right? If you're undocumented, you're now at a higher risk of being placed in deportation proceedings, even if you don't do anything, because you could get caught up in an immigration raid, and you might be placed in deportation proceedings. So I think the key thing is that we want people to have gotten a good screening about their options before they try to pursue something, because that's what could change. I mentioned about how the president does have authority to change certain things, like the temporary protected status program, that the president can decide whether to continue the designation for some of those countries, or to make decisions about the refugee admissions. So those are things that the president could do on his own. There's also going to be issues about whether people who apply are going to be granted protection in the form of discretion. So sometimes for some applications, the immigration agency has authority or discretion to decide whether to grant benefit. People are not necessarily entitled to get it, and I think some of those discretionary decisions are going to get tougher over time with this new administration. In terms of immigration enforcement, I mean, as we talked about, there's increasing, emphasis on the criminal justice system. So I think people who have interactions with the criminal justice system are going to be at greater risk than they were before. We're seeing, I talked about earlier about immigration going after people who have prior deportations. Immigration calls them the fugitive operations teams that are looking for people who have prior deportations, and they're detaining people who they encounter along the way. Increased activity by the Border Patrol. We've seen that before previously. Border Patrol going after people in places like the Skagit, Whatcom, the northern counties, the Olympic Peninsula, in the San Juan Islands. I think there's increased risk that people are going to be questioned in those areas. We are also anticipating a return of a tactic that we've seen in the past, which is the large-scale workplace raids. So this is something that we've seen a lot during the Bush administration, but that was not happening during the Obama administration, where immigration will get maybe a tip or some information about undocumented workers at a certain location, and they will sweep in, and they will bring a ton of agents and will detain everybody who's there and start questioning them. And those who disclose information about the fact that they're undocumented would be detained. And it's always a difficult situation when somebody gets detained by immigration, but those workplace raids are particularly, from a humanitarian perspective, particularly damaging. I had the experience of being in Tacoma when we had a workplace raid in the Portland area, and we had 167 people detained. A lot of them, like many of us, had dropped off their kids in the morning to school. Then they went to work, and the next thing they knew, they were detained and sent to the detention center. Kids were left behind without anybody who would pick them up. It was really a traumatic situation, and so we'll talk a little bit about what we can do regarding that. President Obama had allowed immigration to use prosecutorial discretion to close some cases when the people weren't priorities. That's now no longer happening. And then we're just going to see more and more people end up in immigration detention than we did before. So that's just the new reality of the new administration. So that's kind of the bad news. And the next phase, I just want to talk about what people can do and how we hope you will help people empower communities here. And I want to, let me just take a moment. I want to talk, Joaquin. I'd love to ask you, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell me where you're from or where you were born.
Sure. I was born in Manila, Philippines, and we fled the Marcos regime in the 70s because of instability and violence.
Thank you, Joaquin. Now, you just told me you were born outside the United States, so now you need to show me proof that you're here legally. And I'm joking about that, but it's because I want to illustrate how a simple question that seems very friendly can have very profound consequences. And I want to illustrate, and I didn't put this slide before because you might catch on to what I was doing. I was going to test you to see if you would actually disclose information, and you did. So what can people do? What can people do to prepare? So a few things, and we're going to get into some of these in more details. We want people to know their rights. We want people to make sure that everybody knows about their constitutional rights. We want people to have a family safety plan, and we'll talk more about those in detail. It's really important that people keep informed of developments. Things are changing so fast that it's really important for people to be getting information, because as we talk here today, literally tomorrow, there could be a change, right, with this new executive order. So things are happening very quickly, and people need to be updated about things. We do want to be very worried about scams. I saw today, somebody forwarded me, somebody who's, I can't even think of what kind of person decides to do this. They created a fake deportation order, and they started mailing it to people to scare them. And they had enough sort of skill to like get the logo of ICE and they put some title, and they put the person's name and their address, and they said deportation order to Africa. And it says like, I hereby find that this person needs to leave the country and blah, 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 blah. And they actually got the name of the field operations director here, although they misspelled his name. So it was easy to tell that it was not official. But they mailed that to people. And this person was like freaking out because all of a sudden they got in the mail this notice that they had a deportation order. That stuff is happening. I mean, it's happening here in our local community. So people have to be very wary. And sometimes people are trying to take advantage of them and saying, like, pay this money to be protected or whatever. So people have to be concerned about that. We're asking people to make sure if they're undocumented, to consult with an attorney or a credit representative to figure out if there are options for them to be able to legalize their status, to figure out if there is a path for them. Because if they continue to be undocumented, then there's risk. We're asking people, and I realize that this is not possible for a lot of families, but if they can save money to be prepared for a situation where somebody could be detained, we feel that could be important to pay legal fees or a bond. And then collecting and saving documents that show that the person has been in the United States for a long time. Now, the important thing is collecting and saving, not sending them to anybody, but collecting them. And the reason that might be important is because sometimes if you do get caught up in a deportation proceeding, in many cases that is important to establish to the judge that you've had long ties here in the community. And they're not just going to take your word for it that you've lived here for 15, 20 years. You're going to show evidence of that. And so saving those documents can be very important in that case when there is a situation like that. So let me just get a little deeper into some of these topics, knowing your rights. One of the things that bothers me the most is when people say, well, if somebody's here undocumented, they don't have any rights, right? They don't have the right to be in the United States, so they don't have any rights. That's not true. The U.S. Constitution, if you look at the U.S. Constitution and you look at the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights talks about the rights of persons. And while there are some people out there who think that undocumented people are not people, thankfully the courts have made it very clear that persons means every person, regardless of their immigration status. So everybody in the United States has certain basic constitutional rights. One of the most important for somebody who's undocumented can be the right to remain silent. Because in a number of situations, the only way that an immigration agent knows that the person is undocumented is because the person disclosed that information. So and sometimes they can be kind of friendly, and they think, they ask where you were born. And like happened with Mr. Castillo, once you say that you were born outside the United States, it becomes your burden to show that you're here legally. And so even the friendly question, like, hey, where are you from? That can lead to a lot of problems. They might not, oftentimes they say, hey, you got papers? And they say no. That gives them authority to detain the person. And so very important for people not to disclose information. Now, it's not always going to protect people, because if they already have a record with immigration, then immigration may be able to detain them anyway. If their fingerprints are in the system, if they have a prior deportation order, they may already have information, so even if the person remains silent, they may still be able to detain them. But there's a lot of people who are not in the system, who came across the border without permission, and who are without status and never had any record of immigration. So for those people, it's particularly important that they don't provide any information about where they were born or their immigration status, to be protected from adverse consequences that immigration might have. The people also, regardless of their immigration status, have the right to remain safely in their homes. But what I mean by that is that immigration officers, like any other law enforcement agency, cannot come into a residence or home or a private place without a judicial warrant. And oftentimes, and I got to tell you, most of the time, immigration does not have a judicial warrant when they're looking for somebody. They might have administrative documents, or they have some records, but they don't have a judicial warrant. And so oftentimes they'll come to people's houses and they'll ask to come in, and if the person allows them to come in, then they've been granted consent, and then they can come in. And so it's very important for people to understand that they can say no. Even if it's a law enforcement agency, they can say no. I do not give you permission to come into my house. I do not want you to come into my house, unless you have a warrant. And if you have a warrant, you can slip it under the door and I can look at it. And if it's not a warrant that's signed by a judge or a magistrate, then they don't have to open the door, okay? And I understand that for people it might be hard, especially for people who don't speak English, to distinguish between those two. And there's not an easy way for people to do that, but I want to make sure that people understand that they have that right, because most of the time when we're talking about immigration agencies, they're just not going to have anything to slip under the door, and so they will usually just leave at that point. They might wait for the person outside their home. That does happen. But it might be a way for people to be protected from being detained. There's also, I also just want to emphasize that people who are undocumented also have the right to labor protections. So this is something that a lot of times people also tell me, oh, they're undocumented, they don't qualify for minimum wage, or they don't qualify, they don't have to be given any protection. Absolutely wrong. People are entitled to labor protections, minimum wage, all of the Seattle ordinances, protections at the state level, regardless of immigration status. The challenge is that employers often try to take advantage of the situation and say, if you report this, I will call immigration. So we need to sort of counter that by making sure people know that they can report. And certainly here in our region, there's a lot of agencies that are prepared to help and help protect them. The family safety plan. This is a tough subject to talk about, but we have a lot of families where parents are undocumented, and we have U.S. citizen children, or even if they don't have status, to have children who may get left behind if parents are detained. And so we do ask parents to, particularly parents, to be concerned about who is going to take care of their children if they do end up detained by immigration, and that they, know who's authorized to pick children up from school, and not just, not like I know that somebody's going to go pick them up, because the schools and the childcare places can't just release people to anybody who shows up and says, like, I'm here to pick up Jorge. No, they need to be on the list. And so we want to make sure that people have checked and reviewed that to make sure that somebody is who they trust is going to be able to do that. There's also, there's actually a family safety plan, and as you can see on the screen on our website, that was created by partners that has a lot of the documents that people can fill out. It's translated into, I know right now it's translated in English, Spanish, and another language that I'm forgetting right now. And we're trying to update that and get those in more languages available for people. The forms should be filled out in English. Obviously, the English form. The other languages are just so that people understand what they're filling out. But it's important for people to have a plan. And then, of course, there might be other things beyond family, like property and other things that people need to be prepared, and that might need to fill out documents to prepare for that. So those are just a few of the things that we want people to be prepared about. Now, people ask us, like, what should we tell people? What should they do if they do get detained by ICE? We ask people not to sign documents. Don't sign documents that ICE presents to you. Sometimes ICE is trying to get them to sign off on a deportation, voluntary deportation, waive their right to a hearing, and that is very problematic because they could be giving up an opportunity to be able to stay in the United States. Contact an attorney or a legal services organization to get help. Some people may be eligible to ask for release on bond and ask the judge to grant them, and then to grant them the opportunity to be released on bond, and so they can fight their case but not be detained. And then we want people obviously to implement the safety plan that they hopefully had prepared before. If someone is detained by ICE, who can they call? What we tell people is that if the family or relatives or friends are in a position to hire a private immigration attorney, we really encourage them to do that because that's the only way that you're going to guarantee that the person's going to have an attorney representing them in their case. But if they cannot do that, then they should contact our Tacoma office. The number's up on the screen, and they can leave a message there about the name of the individual. What our office can do is we provide legal orientation and consultation sessions for people who are detained to try to figure out their options. And then people who have a way to contest their deportation, who cannot afford an attorney, we will try to place with volunteer attorneys or with our staff, but there's just far too much demand for people who have, even for that group of people who have an ability to fight. So a lot of people, unfortunately, end up going unrepresented despite our best efforts. So that's why we say to people, if they can afford a private attorney, please do that. Let me turn to some frequently asked questions before we open it up. Some things that come up frequently that people have asked us, and I want to just try to address ahead of time. So the first thing that people have asked us a lot is about sanctuary policies and locations, and we're very proud that the City of Seattle and a number of jurisdictions in the state have adopted the sanctuary label and have enacted policies to help protect our communities. It's important for people to understand what that means. So generally, there's no legal definition to the term sanctuary or welcoming. But generally, it's referred to jurisdictions that have said that they're not going to use local resources, that their local law enforcement or their local agencies are not going to ask questions about immigration status. They're not going to hold people on behalf of immigration, or they may not contact immigration agencies to report people. But that does not mean that immigration agencies themselves, immigration agencies can still act and operate with their own resources within that location. So let's take the City of Seattle. Seattle Police Department is not going to ask questions about immigration status. It's not going to hold people because of immigration violations. But despite the fact that the City of Seattle is a sanctuary jurisdiction, immigration agencies, ICE, can still come into the City of Seattle and conduct raids and detain people at homes or at other locations within the city. So that's an important thing that people need to understand, because sometimes people feel that that ICE somehow is not allowed to pursue in those jurisdictions. The other questions that we get in this area is, what is the situation with certain locations like schools or churches? So ICE has a memo called the Sensitive Locations Memo, which talks about the fact that ICE discourages or tries to avoid enforcement actions in those locations, okay? One of the big questions that we had was, is this memo going to survive the new administration? The good news is that in the implementation memo that they issued, some of the frequently asked questions that they issued on February 20th, ICE did say that that memo continues to be in place as of now. So it appears that that memo will continue to be in place. Now, it's important to understand that memo does not say that ICE will not conduct operations in those locations, that they will never go into a church or they will never go into a school. It just says that they will try to avoid it, and that it has to go through the supervisory process for them to engage in that kind of situation. So unfortunately, I can't give people assurances that it won't happen, but just some reassurance that at least it is areas that they've recognized as areas of concern where they need to be operating in a different manner than other areas. Now, other questions that we've gotten is, will this new administration, how will this impact a number of things? How will it impact state-funded financial aid for undocumented or documented students? So there's been a number of programs that have developed over the last few years, like the bill that passed a few years ago that was labeled the Washington State Dream Act, or the Real Hope Act, that provided, opened up opportunities for some state financial aid to be provided to undocumented students. For the most part, most of those programs are not going to be impacted by federal policies because they're a matter of state law. There are some narrow situations where a program called College Bound Scholarship, for example, was it tied the benefits to DACA status. And so, for example, the DACA program goes away, that might impact some of the coverage of this program. So there are some situations where it could end up affecting people, but for the most part, the answer is no. The other question is, like, can they use some of that data? Can they use data against people? I think that there's risks of that. But I do want people to be somewhat reassured. I mean, I've been asked questions like, for example, if I apply for federal financial aid using the FAFSA form, I'm a U.S. citizen, I'm applying for federal financial aid, but my parents are undocumented. They ask questions about my parents' information there. And so could that put them at risk? The first thing I would say is that there are some federal protections, federal privacy protections with regard to some of that data. And so they're pretty, there are some protections that don't allow for that to be shared without search warrants and other protections. But I also would say, so therefore I can't guarantee that information will never come to light. But I think the risk of that is so low, and the benefits that we're talking about are so important that, in my consideration, I would never discourage people from applying for those benefits based on that risk. I've also been asked about people who file taxes with the individual tax identification numbers, for example. So a lot of undocumented people are filing for taxes, and they're worried about that. On that point, I will tell you that there is an actual a separate privacy protection under our tax laws that say that information is also confidential. So it cannot be used except in a criminal investigation. And so I don't think that it's going to be used for general immigration enforcement. We've been asked about what about driver's licenses for undocumented people? Well, the new administration is not necessarily changing that, but there may be some changes with regard to a federal law known as Real ID that actually was passed in 2005 but has not been implemented. And so one of the things that you might start seeing is that there's some talk about the fact that our driver's licenses are no longer going to be accepted at the airport for TSA because they don't comply with this federal requirement. And one of the reasons that it doesn't comply is because we allow people who are undocumented to receive licenses. So there's some proposals right now in the legislature to change our licensing system. I can't tell you where that's going to end up, but I can tell you that people are working very hard to make sure that undocumented people will continue to be able to have the ability to get driver's licenses. And if that's something that's important to you, I certainly would encourage you to talk to your legislators about that. Access to public benefits for undocumented individuals and their families. I think there's going to be some legislative proposals certainly that could impact this and budgetary issues. But there are also there's been some leaks about potential federal executive orders that could cause some concern in the community about the use of public benefits. So that's something that we're monitoring. I'm not going to get into it right now because it's very uncertain right now, but it's something that I think people need to get a lot of information because it depends on what the announcement is, and we'll need to get more information to the community on that point. Other questions that people ask us is, how do people access good legal advice in terms of immigration? And I'd say to people, it is challenging. This area is a very complicated area of law, and people tell us, well, private immigration attorneys are expensive. Yes, getting good legal services is an expensive matter. It takes training. The cases, particularly in immigration, take a long time, and so lawyers are people too, and they have to pay for their costs, and so that's that can be a challenge, and so. People need to understand that attorneys are not magicians, so they're operating in a tough environment with the law, and they can't always succeed. And they need to talk to the attorney be realistic about their chances. There are some people out there who are trying to take advantage of the community. Sometimes it's bad attorneys. Sometimes it's consultants, immigration consultants. Sometimes in the Latino community they refer to as notarios, who are trying to take advantage of people and who are not authorized to practice immigration law. People need to be very careful about that. There are nonprofit organizations that are recognized by the Board of Immigration Appeals to provide different types of immigration services. I'll tell you a little bit about more of those in a second. And those agencies can have people that are designated as accredited representatives that are not attorneys, but they're authorized to practice immigration law. So that is one resource that can provide help. This is a quick resource of different organizations and entities. There's a National Immigration Legal Services Directory that people can access. There's a list that the government keeps of the recognized agencies. And then there's a referral source for private immigration attorneys that's run by the American Immigration Lawyers Association. And then there's a great website for non-immigration legal questions called WashingtonLawHelp.org that we encourage people to check out because you get a lot of information. A quick point about our intake process. If people are trying to refer cases to Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, I've put up here on the screen our numbers for our Western Washington and Eastern Washington offices. We ask people to call instead of come to our office because the way that we have it set up, we're not set up so that people will be able to talk to an attorney immediately. They'll have to call to make an appointment. Right now we're getting a very large volume of calls, so unfortunately people are going to have to be patient, and sometimes we'll have to wait to be able to speak to somebody, and we're trying to work on that, but it's the reality that we're facing right now. And if people do understand the issue that they're dealing with, then it's important for them to tell us what they're looking for. If they're calling about a U visa situation or they're calling about citizenship, if they can specify that quickly, that would be great. Of course, we're a confidential, as a legal service organization, all the information they provide is confidential. Finally, in our website, I know this may not be easy to read, but on the resources tab of our website, we have a lot of information, know your rights information, updates about what's happening that is important for people to share and that we encourage you to share with the community. And as I mentioned before, it is on that page, on the resources, the Know Your Rights, that we will have the updated copy of the PowerPoint that we're talking tonight so that you see it. And please try to stay up to date. And if you want to be on our list, on our email list, you can sign up at the website as well. And with that, we have come to the point. And one more thing before we turn it to the questions. There's also a network of local organizations that is working on right now, and that we just launched the website for, which is called Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network. The website link is up right now, and that is a group of entities and individuals who are working to respond. So if you're interested in volunteering, in getting plugged into efforts broadly about responding and addressing the needs of immigrant refugee communities, I'd encourage you to visit the website, and there's a way to sign up to volunteer and to be plugged into the email list. So that's another resource. And with that, I am going to open it up for questions.
So I see a number of questions. I just want to let you know the order we're going to go in. We're going to start from the back of the auditorium and work our way to the front. And at the very end, if there happens to be anybody who's watching on our Facebook Live channel, we'll have space to take some questions at the end from Facebook Live. Just one or two. Sound like a plan? So again, we're starting from the back and we'll work our way to the front.
So we're going to wait until the microphone gets up there, and then we will go. Who's got the first question? Okay, the person with the microphone gets the question. So there you go.
Is this on? Oh. Thank you. What information do you have for business owners and managers about what to expect in the workplace, what kind of communication to expect from ICE, and how to act?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I want to make sure, I'm going to repeat the question just to make sure that it's clear for the people who are watching on the Facebook Live. So the question is about resources for employers in responding to immigration rates. So I can tell you that our colleagues at the American Immigration Lawyers Association are currently working on a resource that I don't think it's available quite this moment, but I expect to be available in the next few weeks, in the next few days, hopefully. And we will, as soon as that's available, we'll put that in the resources page of our website. I will tell you just quickly that, employers have rights to keep immigration agents out of locations that are not public, right? So it's like any other, immigration agents have the same right to enter that, anybody else in the community has. So if it's a public space, they can enter. But if it's a private space and the general public is not authorized to come in, they can't come in unless they have a warrant. Now, sometimes immigration agents may be authorized to do audits of things like the I-9 form, et cetera. So, and again, some of that information will be in this guide. But I do want to emphasize that even employers have rights as to their private property with regard to allowing people in. So I think we would encourage employers to understand the rights that they have to sometimes say no and not allow immigration agents to enter the premises unless the agents have a warrant, as would be the case in a private home. But we'll make that resource available as soon as it's up. Okay.
Hi. So I guess my question is, once we've removed an immigrant to another country, how does that country know that that immigrant belongs to them? And how does that process work?
Yeah, so the question was about when somebody gets deported, how does that country know that the person is a citizen there from that area? And actually, that can be an interesting question. Sometimes they don't know. So when immigration detains somebody, they usually have to work, and somebody's actually ordered deported. So sometimes the person does have documentation, right? They already have a passport or some document that establishes their identity and the fact that they're a citizen from that country. But oftentimes they do not. And so then they have to work with the consulate or the embassy from that country to try to determine and to get them to issue travel documents. And I will say that sometimes the country, for a variety of reasons, maybe because they can't establish, they will not. Or in some cases, some countries, like for example, Cuba, for a long time has refused to accept people from being sent back, and so they have not issued documentation. They've not allowed permission to have the people return. And what ended up happening was that sometimes people would detain for a long time because they would be in this limbo. They couldn't be sent back. The government wouldn't release them. Eventually, there were some Supreme Court decisions that said you can't detain people indefinitely. After a certain period of time, you have to provide them an opportunity for a bond hearing to release them. And so now, immigration generally, if the person cannot be returned to the home country, they will release them here under something they call an order of supervision. And they're, here, they might be eligible to apply for a work permit in that situation, and it's until their country decides to take them back. So that's a little bit of how that process works. Yes?
Thanks. There's been some reports of customs officials or security officials at airports detaining people, looking at their cell phones and laptops, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that and give some advice for visa holders who have to travel during this time.
Sure. So the question was about searches and things at airports, and I'll just say more broadly the border when people are entering the country. So a couple of things. So one thing, actually, your question made me remember about a situation that happened at JFK that some of you may have read about, where immigration agents were checking documents as people were leaving a plane on a domestic flight. And a lot of the people have asked us about that situation, and I want to emphasize that we believe that immigration agents have no authority to require people to provide documentation when people are leaving an airplane. It's different. They may not allow you on the plane, but if you're leaving the plane, you have every right to refuse to provide documentation when you're leaving a plane. With regard to the question about when you're entering the United States, the Supreme Court has said that when people are coming into the United States, including U.S. citizens, that you have lesser rights and that the government has more authority to search you than they would normally just when you're inside the United States, because they can check to see if you have things that are potentially dangerous or contraband, right? Drugs. So the fact that they can search you is something that is established, but I think at least for us, we believe that right is that there's still protections, and so them getting into, without any kind of other evidence that there's some problem, trying to get into your laptop or your personal information, we do not believe they have the authority to require you to do that. But I will tell you that it's still an issue. Some of these things are still being litigated about the limits that they can have. In my opinion, my advice to people is that they don't need to provide passwords or to do that. But if they refuse, the authorities may, place you in secondary and may convenience you. So you need to consider that. You should certainly assert if there is confidential information. The reason you don't want to disclose it, I have my phone, I have my email with lots of confidential information in there that is protected by attorney-client privilege. So I would certainly assert that in my case. But it's an area where things are still developing in terms of the case law of what's authorized and what is not.
With regards to the provisional waiver, is that program at risk by the new administration, particularly if the waiver has been approved? And my second question is, can you give an update on the DACA Plus after the Supreme Court turned it down?
Great. Thank you. So the first question was about the provisional waiver, and just to remind those of you that this is kind of in the middle of the presentation, so this is the way that you can apply for the waiver to waive the 10-year bar so that you can, go outside of the United States, get your green card, and be able to come back without having to wait 10 years outside. So that program was created by President Obama through something called a federal regulation. So it wasn't an executive order. It was a federal regulation that had to go through like a more significant process that has to go through a notice and comment period, and it took some time to put it on the books. So that's now a regulation in there. It's not a statute, it's not a law that Congress passed. So President Trump can't just come in and say, I'm going to get rid of this regulation. He can propose to end it. So he would have to go through a similar process of notice and comment of repealing that. And he has the authority to start that process, but he can't do it as quickly as he can do other things, like the DACA program, for example, right? And so, so for people who are currently applying for that or who have been approved, that still remains in place. He can't take it away now. Now, I think they're going to be tougher on some of those cases. That, they're going to might look at those more closely. They might deny more. That's kind of a discretionary decision, right? And so it still may get tougher to get the actual waiver granted than it did under the Obama administration. But they can't repeal the program as quickly as they could other things. The second question that you asked was about, and I didn't talk about this, but some of you may remember that President Obama, after he launched the DACA program, which started running, he did another announcement in November 2014 that would have expanded the DACA program to include more people and created this other program that was called DAPA, Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, that would have protected parents of U.S. citizens. That program was put on hold by litigation in Texas, and ultimately it got blocked. It went up to the Supreme Court and ended up in a tie, and so the program remained blocked until the end of the Obama administration. That part has not officially, the memo has not been withdrawn by the current administration yet, but they've indicated to the court that put that program on hold that that there's going to be some changes to it, and I don't have much hope that expansion or the DAPA program. I don't think anybody has any hope that that's going to be implemented, and it's likely that we're going to see that be withdrawn at some point soon, unfortunately. I'm depending on the folks with the mics. Who's got it next? I can't see.
Hi.
There you go. Hi. And there's a few folks in the front that I also want to make sure we don't miss. Go ahead.
I was wondering what a human service provider, like a nonprofit, could do for its clients if they maybe wanted to establish themselves, or if it was even possible to be considered a sensitive location. Also, if their workplace is in a public place and ICE does show up, what items do they absolutely have to give over? What do they not have to give? What is protecting them as well?
So let me make sure I got the question correctly. So a human service is a nonprofit entity. What rights do they have? What they can do to protect people who are accessing services? So I do think it's an important conversation for people, for nonprofit agencies to have who are serving immigrant and refugee communities, to understand what their policies are, what their response is going to be. I think one of the questions that you asked was whether you could sort of self-designate as a sensitive location. I think you can say that, but ICE may not respect that. So ICE has a list of things that are considered sensitive locations that includes things like churches and schools and public events, childcare places. So if your entity, if your organization has one of those, then then I would certainly emphasize that and say that you should be considered a sensitive location because of that. But I think the thing is, that I think organizations should have training and policies about what you're going to do. Make it very clear the parts of your area that are not open to public access, to not give permission, to make sure that people are informed if the immigration agents come in, that they have the right to remain silent. You do not have to disclose information about the people you're serving unless people have a search warrant, unless immigration agents or a law enforcement agency has an actual search warrant or a subpoena. And so you should you don't have, just because an agent asks for something, you absolutely do not have to disclose any of that information. And in some cases, you may be covered by confidentiality provisions that prevent you from doing that. That's certainly the case for us as a legal services organization. We're covered by attorney-client privilege and confidentiality rules, so we cannot disclose that information, and we frankly would fight any kind of subpoena for that information. And so, so you do not have voluntarily disclosed information in those situations.
Jorge, this question is from Facebook Live. It's being asked by Megan. The question is, are there any protections for undocumented Washington license holders that are pulled over for moving violations and then detained? So it sounds like Washington driver's license.
So people who have like a Washington driver's license who are pulled over and detained. So if, we do have situations, and we have seen situations where the people who are who have prior deportations may come up in a system that the law enforcement agency, that may trigger some information to ICE. So I do want to sort of reassure people that it doesn't happen all the time that a simple traffic stop will lead to somebody being turned over to ICE, but unfortunately, sometimes it could lead to that, and one of the situations where that's a greater risk is if the person has a prior deportation order. I think the important thing in a traffic stop situation is that we inform community members and that we help them know that they don't have to disclose additional information. So people have to obviously show their driver's license and their registration, but that driver's license does not, does not show anything about immigration status, right? Like driver's licenses do not have any information about where we're born or what our immigration status is. So that in itself, the fact that you have a Washington driver's license does not mean that you're undocumented, right? Because we all carry them, right? But if a law enforcement agency, and this will likely happen outside of Seattle, outside of Seattle and not likely in some other jurisdictions, but if they ask, what's your status? You don't have to answer those questions, right? You don't, besides providing your driver's license and your insurance information, your vehicle registration, you don't have to make additional disclosures. So I think the protection that we have is, again, the right to remain silent in those other contexts. All right. Go ahead.
Hi. I have this question. If somebody had some process in immigration, if ICE detain the person, what happened?
And they repeat the first part of your question, sorry.
Somebody had process with immigration, and what happened with the people is retained for ICE.
So if somebody's detained for another crime and then they get referred to immigration?
No, it's like somebody had processing immigration.
Okay.
Consequently, what happened with the people is retained for ICE.
Well, so it depends on where the process they are. So, I mean, some of the processes can take a long time. And so if the person has just initiated a case to try to get immigration status, right? But they haven't actually completed the process, and they get flagged by ICE for some other reason. If they were detained, they were arrested for a criminal offense. Unfortunately, ICE is likely to put that person likely to have them detained and be placed in deportation proceedings, despite the fact that they have something pending. They have discretion not to do it, but they could still end up being detained by immigration. So unfortunately, having something pending is not always a protection. I mean, it might have been more of a protection during the Obama administration, but I wouldn't count on it under the current administration. Okay.
Okay, we have time for one more. Is it going to be?
Thank you for doing this. So my question is, how can organizations support Americans?
Okay. Thank you. So how can you support NERP? Well, I would like to think that it's supporting, the entire community. It's not just about our organization, because there's a lot of groups that are doing it. So people who want to get involved in the effort, I would encourage people to join the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network. That is the place where we're having a lot of these conversations, and there's different working groups. Some people are working on education issues, for example, that are working with youth about how to work on the issues that affect them. Some folks are working in raid response, how to respond to like big immigration or small immigration raids. Other folks are working on communication and getting online tools and information out to the community. So I think that's the place right now where we're trying to encourage organizations and people to get plugged in. To do that. I think one of the things that we are encouraging, certainly for our organization, we're trying to do these kind of series of events to try to provide information to our nonprofit partners so that they know how to refer people, they know what information they can provide, they can try to provide and share the resources that are developed. I know, and we appreciate, we're getting a lot of requests for people to get more information, and we're trying to process those as quickly as we can. But I think we're trying to also encourage people to attend the big events, to share. There's going to be a video of this recorded, to share that with your staff, with your colleagues, so that they're also getting this information, because not everybody can come downtown at 6 p.m., right? And that, we're talking to other people. I mean, I think the other thing is that we want to make sure that we're talking about this, and that's why I said in the beginning, congratulations and thank you, because I think a lot of people are may not have the information, may not know what's happening, and it's affecting all of us in the community. And so sharing the resources is really important. Obviously, I will say a lot of the nonprofit agencies that are working on this, need financial support, so that people who, helping spread the word about that is important. But I think more than anything else, it's sharing the information about resources, plugging into the different work through the network that is happening, connecting with entities like the City of Seattle's Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs that is doing great work, and being ready, doing proactive steps of educating each other as service providers, and helping to share information with the community. I can tell you that there's things that we're working on, for example, like a hotline to report immigration raids. So once we get that information out, we need people to help us get that information out to the community. And again, a lot of this is happening so fast and changing so quickly that when we get those, new information, that we're sharing it with the community as new information develops. So hopefully that's part of the answer. And I think and again, we are so grateful to all of you. I'm happy to stick around here for a couple minutes. I know there are a few of you that didn't get to ask your questions, but for those of you that are watching live, thank you so much for participating tonight. And thank you to all of you for being involved and energized by this important topic. Thank you.